das war dann der ist halt, okay. Also er ist halt extrem verdient. Ich habe gedacht, wenn man jetzt über die Options weggehen und dann evaluieren müsste, wäre das aber das war sehr ja. Ja, Flugsituation, die sich dann
Okay, I propose that we get started with this third lecture in our lecture series on risk and uncertainty. My name is Fabrice Renaud. I'm the head of section at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, and I will be sharing this lecture. Welcome to everybody, and it's my great privilege to introduce our third lecturer in the series, Professor Finn Tarp, who is a colleague of ours from UNU-WIDER, and WIDER stands for World Institute for Development Economics Research. He will be speaking about aid, growth, and development, how we come full circle, question mark. So apart from being the director of UNU-WIDER, Finn also holds the chair of Professor of Development Economics at the Department of Economics at the University of Copenhagen, where he completed also his master's and PhD degrees in economics. Finn has some 30 years of experience in academic and applied development economics research and teaching. His field of experience covers numerous countries across Africa and the developing world more generally, including some longer-term assignments in Swaziland, Mozambique, and Vietnam. He is a leading international expert on issues of development strategy and foreign aid, with an interest in poverty, income distribution and growth, micro and macroeconomic policy and modeling, agricultural sector policy and planning, household and enterprise development, and economic adjustment and reform. In addition to his university positions, Finn held senior posts and advisory positions within government and with donor organizations, and he's a member of a large number of international committees and advisory bodies. So, Finn, the way we're going to be proceeding for this lecture is that the next speaker will, of course, be Finn in a few seconds. You will have about 45 minutes for your lecture. I will then give the floor to our discussant, who today will be Professor Braun from ZEF, who will ask the first barrage of questions to Finn. Finn, you will then have the floor to answer for 5-10 minutes, and after this, we will open the floor to all of you for questions to Finn that we will then answer. So, without any further delays, Finn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's clear that I am, of course, always ready, and I'm always very pleased to be at occasions like this to try to provide some wider perspectives on things, is what we sort of normally internally joke. I mean, we do like the wider perspective. What I try to do today is that I try to give you a story. There are technical elements in there. I will be trying to sort of skim relatively lightly over those, but I sort of suggest that they are there. But I'm basically going to try to tell you a story about more than 40 years of research. Why do I think that that story is interesting? I think it's interesting because it concerns an important relationship between the developed world and the developing world. And there is a lot of rhetoric associated with this, and I think that it's nice if we can sort of make sure that we're really all trying to speak on the same basis, at least the same sort of core of things. What do we know and what do we not know? But let me try and get going. It's pretty clear that the effectiveness of foreign aid is very contentious. I mean, you know, you're having the Easterlies and the Saxons of this world. They are up there fighting, discussing a lot on the front pages. And I mean, you can sort of discuss or you can think about, is that really surprising that you have this sort of high level of contentiousness? And I would suggest that it's not really surprising. And I mean, one key reason is that aid is given for many reasons. And the second point is that this sort of question, which Casson came up with in his famous book on Does Aid Work, it has very many interpretations. We mean different things. So very often the debates are simply because people don't speak about the same thing. And let's now do the economics tricks and sort of say, all right, let's now assume that we agree on the purpose. Let's, for example, say that we agree that aid should reduce poverty, that that's sort of the core function. Well, then the how remains open. Why? Well, Ravi Kapoor wrote a very nice article some years back that was published in the World Development. And he starts out by saying, we have different perceptions of market structure and power. We simply do not agree always on causal relationships. And it's not that easy always to tease out of the data these causal relationships. So that's one reason. We work at very different levels of aggregation. I mean, some of us work in air-conditioned offices, sitting in the capital, and when we sort of think about what's happening in this country, this is clearly sort of this overall macro, and we sort of think about, okay, is the direction right? Others are out there in a small village sweating it out, carrying out a household survey, and their perception of what's happening may be very different. So we work at different levels of aggregation. And we work with very different time horizons. Some of us are more sort of concerned about the long sort of what's happening over time, and we sort of think about sort of decades. Others are more concerned about what happens tomorrow. So there are lots of reasons for disagreeing. Now, the main question I'm going to try to answer as a start for this discussion today, and I would like to say this is as a start of the discussion that we're going to have today, is a pretty simple one, but it shows up to be relatively difficult to answer in practice. Does foreign aid boost economic growth on average in developing countries? Now that's the research question I'm going to try to weave my story around. Now, it's much debated in both the popular and in the academic literature. I mean, Dambisa Moyo has been out there recently saying that the notion that aid can alleviate systemic poverty and has done so is a myth. Millions in Africa are poorer today because of aid. Misery and poverty have not ended but have increased. So in other words, a very strong argument that aid is not only useless, it's actually harmful. It actually does no good. You should get rid of it. And then she makes one exception. Humanitarian aid we can live with. But all the rest should basically just get away with it. Paul Collier, in his book on the bottom billion, says, well, a reasonable estimate is that over the last 30 years, aid has added around 1 percentage point to the annual growth rate of the bottom billion. So, okay. Not sort of substantial, not massive, maybe not the expectations we had, but at least added a 1% a year is not sort of completely something to be ignored. So these are just two examples. But, I mean, there is so much written out there. And I would suggest that trying to grapple with this one question maybe can sort of be helpful in opening up one's eyes for what is it really that we should be discussing. Now, there are many objections to pursuing this issue, and I don't want to hide that. I mean, take another literature about the impact of schooling on earnings. There's a huge literature on it. I mean, it's one of the most debated issues in economics, and it's characterized by sort of the same challenges that we are facing in this area. One specific challenge is what we refer to as endogenous selection. Donors give aid to countries that have problems. Well, that means that if you don't control for those problems, you are bound to get the impact of aid wrong. There are other challenges. You are having heterogeneous treatment effects. You are having mismeasurement of all kinds of things. It's not easy. But I would like to say that this is not just this area. It's not just aid and growth. This is something that we are struggling with across the board. And I really do feel quite strongly that there are profound dangers involved if economists don't want to try to engage on this. Because if we basically just say, nope, this is too complicated, we don't really want to engage, turn our back to it and walk away and do something else, it's pretty clear that the rhetoric will then take over. It would leave the field very open to what I consider very unhelpful rhetoric. And there is a lot of rhetoric out there, and it's not helpful. And that goes for both sides. Now, another argument which I'd like to sort of highlight is that we have not always been very good in the aid field to be humble. We have often made excessive claims about what aid can do and what it should do. But humility is required. But, and then this is the other side of it, there is a certain amount of sort of core set of things we are starting to be able to say relatively firmly. And the story which I'm going to try to tell is about 4 generations of analysis that's spanning more than 40 years. And I personally believe at least it merits some attention in thinking about the point of departure. Where should we go from here? So let me now go on to this empirical literature. Now, as I said, what does aid work mean? Well, this can, as I said, mean very many different things. I'm not ignoring this. One way, if you could maybe say an economist perspective, well, it is that high income is associated with good standards of living. I mean, we perfectly well know that there's a lot of variation, right? It's not a very simple relationship, but by and large, it's better to be in a high income country. All the social aspects, the human development indicators, they tend to be better if we're sort of in high income countries. Okay. So, you might want to ask the question, how to get high income? Well, one avenue is pretty simple, savings, investment, growth. I know that that has not been in focus in a lot of the economics literature over the sort of past 10, 15 years. But when you actually get down to it and actually think, how do you actually get growth processes going? It's pretty clear that you need to save either domestically or get money from outside. You do need to invest productively. And that's a core element of the growth process. So, in my view, in my argument, does aid work? It should at least involve attention to, does aid increase savings? Does aid increase investment? Does aid increase growth? Asking these specific questions and trying to get informed about it. Again, I'm not saying that this will solve everything and this will be the complete solution to these puzzles, but at least it might be suggestive to look at what are the answers. And obviously you could add in other dimensions. You could ask questions, for example, what does aid do to economic policy making, or what does aid do, etc., etc. I'm going to concentrate on these 3. Now, what is the problem? Well, the problem is that it's not easy to measure the true impact of aid. I mean, sometimes we try to look at targets and we compare them with actual outcomes. Well, we know that that's very insufficient. That's not satisfactory. Because targets might have been set completely unrealistically. So then the fact that you don't get or achieve those targets is not really the fault of the intervention, in this case, the aid. You sometimes do these exercises, you compare before and after. Well, before and after, lots of things might have happened in the meantime. So there is the need for a counterfactual. We cannot avoid, if we want to be serious, we cannot avoid to ask the question or to try to grapple with the question with and without. We know what happened with the aid, but do we know what would have happened without the aid? If we're not willing to stick out our neck and postulate or suggest or justify what we think would have happened without the aid, then basically we haven't done our job. Now, this is difficult, it's controversial. I mean, it's not easy. What do we as economists do? Well, we often use statistical methods to try to deal with this. And a very integral part of my story is about economists and methods. Just to sort of illustrate how things can get wrong, but also how they can get right. Now, sorry, let me just, before I take the next step, what would you expect from a very simple, ordinary least square regression, where you just take the growth and the aid and you plot all the observations you can find? What would you expect? A positive or a negative relationship? The answer is a negative relationship. Why? Because of the endogeneity of aid. You give basically aid to countries that have problems. So you should actually expect a negative relationship, or at least sort of a relatively flat relationship. Why? For example, when countries are doing really well. I worked in Vietnam for a long time. Vietnam is now, in quote, so-called graduating. Vietnam is now doing well, so it is now getting out of the aid recipients. So you should expect either a negative relationship or sort of a not very simple one. But let's now go back to the aid and growth literature of the 1970s and 1980s. There was some very early optimism. You know, we had the Marshall Plan earlier on. We thought that aid can do lots of fantastic things. And then Papanek put out a few very influential articles in some very, very top 5 journals, Journal of Political Economy. This was really influential. It was very, very simple. It was absolutely simple cross-country regressions, and that basically led to people assuming that aid would lead to increased savings, would lead to increased investment, and therefore to growth. But increasing disappointment very quickly set in. People got very unhappy with the traditional models of sort of aid. The idea sort of, or the consensus sort of became, well, aid may work at the micro. And you will note that I'm not speaking very much about micro in my presentation. We can talk a lot about it. But there is a big, substantial amount of evidence that aid does seem to work at the micro level. I mean, we do know that aid helps build schools, that aid does help train children, that aid helps in relation to vaccination campaigns, etc., etc., etc. But somehow the thinking became, it's as if that when you move from the micro up to the macro, it is as if the impact of aid evaporates. And there can be many good reasons. I mean, one, for example, reason is the so-called Dutch disease, right? I mean, you know, if you give resources to a country, then what happens to its exchange rate? It becomes overvalued, so you're essentially killing the economy that way. So you may well have some productive projects, but at the macro, it's not there. At least that's how people have argued. They have not always then thought through what is the actual size of that aid that is meant to cause that Dutch disease, and putting that in relation to what's actually happening in the economy. And you have very often, for example, heard arguments like, oh, we have these terrible dictators, they use all this aid money for buying weapons and other bad things, and then at the same time we have Dutch disease. Now, if you stop for a second and just sort of, hey, is that actually possible? If you're actually using the aid money for importing things, then you're completely sterilizing. So, I mean, there are sort of things that you really kind of should think through before you actually argue these things. But the fact of the matter is that the idea of micro-macro paradox became quite well accepted. It sort of became part of the mainstream, if you wish. Failure, late 80s, mid 80s. No, it set in quite sort of around somewhere in the 70s. We started becoming not quite as optimistic as we used to be. We were still quite optimistic when I joined the FAO in 1978, but you know, and then what was it? Look, it was lots of things. First of all, because we were in very difficult times. That's one thing. Another thing was that we really became aware that it's not like that whatever happens on the recipient side, that they're just angels. I mean, there was a lot of misuse. There were dictators that didn't behave the way we would like to according to the good old days. we started recognizing that there are incentives associated. When you transfer money, there are potential incentive effects, both at the sort of overall macro, but also at the individual level. Politicians may not behave the same way when they get aid, and so on and so forth. Now, and there were a number of studies, and I've always been completely puzzled. It was as if the left, here illustrated with Paul Mosley, the right, here illustrated with Anne Kruger, and if you wish, sort of the center, illustrated by Howard White. And you're talking about, we're talking about sort of IMF, World Bank on the one hand, we're talking about independent academics on the other, different types and so on. They basically were completely agreed there is a micro-macro paradox, and there is really no impact at the macro level. It was said in study after study that, for example, these three put out. I taught those papers. And out of that came, I became skeptical. Not because I necessarily wanted to become an apologetic for aid, which I'm not. But I wasn't convinced about what they ran. So the basic question that crept in was, what did the cross-country research actually show? And now I say first and second, this is about the impact on savings and the impact on investment and so on. So that there are two generations here, but leaving that aside. What did the actual econometric studies that were out there, did they show what these people said was the synthesis of the literature? So then, together with a colleague of mine who's a stronger econometrician than I am, we basically started collecting. It took about 2 years. But we collected every single econometric study that had been done. 131 of them. And, well, several studies showed that aid is associated with decreased savings, which is not completely surprising, right? I mean, if you give me $1 million, I might decrease my prior savings a bit, right? But there was only one study that basically showed that when you take the decrease in savings and you take the inflow of aid, that then the impact is still negative. There's just one. So essentially, all of these studies basically suggest that net savings is positive when you take account of the decrease because of the aid, but then the inflow of the aid. So on net, there's a positive addition, except for that one study. And I mean, that is basically the complete outlier. There was not one single study that shows that aid decreases investment. Aid increases investment. Now, that doesn't prove that aid promotes growth, because you can have a lot of unproductive investment. But there was only one study and one regression that actually shows a negative impact on growth of aid. Only one. Paul Mosley's own. Now, it's not surprising that there was a number of insignificant studies, but the number of significant results clearly outweighed the insignificant ones. We were in the early days, so you should expect some insignificant results, right? That comes out of what we just spoke about before. What should you expect? Quite a few of these studies were just basically ordinary square studies, nothing else. So it's not surprising that there were a number of insignificant results, but there was also quite a substantial literature, it added up to quite a substantial literature of positive impact. So our conclusion, of course, is, first and second, well, I mean, whether you appreciate the models or not, whether you think they're too simplistic, whether you think, etc., etc., etc. But when you actually go through the 131, this is what we got out of it. So, aid seemed to work, at least more or less. All right. Let's get to the 1990s. I should say, by the way, that that paper was published by Paul Mosley himself, who has essentially basically said, yes, that was correct. I mean, we had uncovered what his problems in that model was. So that, of course, also added some confidence to us thinking that we were probably not off track. Well, 1990s, we got new data, right? Time went by, so we added for every year, every country, so we started having these nice panel data sets so we could do more fancy things. We got new theory. We introduced economic policy and institutions directly in our growth models. And we started to grapple with how do we take account properly of the endogeneity of aid. We also realized that, hey, wait a second, these relationships may not be linear as they were in the very early models. They may sort of look like this, right? Or they may even look like this. Diminishing returns. And the econometricians stepped forward and basically came up with lots of new GMM methods where essentially they tried to suggest that you can use internal instruments. And Boone really sparked the debate when in 1994 he put out a paper which the Economist quoted as "aid is down the rat hole." That's how the Economist put it out. Now, Boone very quickly started fading. And there are sort of two sets of reasons for that. One is that there are actually some serious problems in his papers, but that's leaving that aside. The other reason was that a couple of people have been working in the World Bank, David Burnside and David Dollar. And I mean, if you're basically living out of transferring aid to countries, then of course the Boone result is not particularly encouraging, right? I mean, it's a bit of a headache, right? If it's really down the rat hole, then you should really get out of the business. Try and think about there'll be some oil, right? I mean, there's a similarity there, which is kind of interesting. So the bank worked a lot on it. And they were working seriously on trying to think about how could we make aid work better. And they came out with a message. Aid works. And then they added, but only in good policy countries. Now, this was a brilliant, how can you say, at the level of policy advice, this was a brilliant way of approaching it. Because essentially what they did, when I say brilliant, this is sort of to be understood in the right way, but essentially they took this Gordian knot, the micro-macro paradox, right? And then what did they do? They basically cut it in the middle. They basically, we have this, so here are the countries where it will work, and here are the countries where it will not work. So essentially what they did was that they shifted the aid allocation debate from what had been the debate of the 1980s, which was conditionality, right? You give money for countries to get them to do something right. But shifted to the debate becoming a selectivity debate. Let's choose the right countries, and then we can get the effectiveness of aid right, or better at least. Now, I used to sort of joke about it and say, well, why don't we give all the money to Norway? I mean, because of course this was skimming over an important problem, which was, well, you have to balance the needs versus the impact. And then this was bothering a number of us. And it was bothering us in particular because they kept their data secret. I mean, we couldn't get them. They put out their policy reports and the data were not out there. I put forward an official request through the DAC, and they kept their data for themselves. We could not get them before many years later. So we started a separate exercise of collecting all the data because we thought there must be something in there. Well, they based their result on what's called an aid policy interaction term. Okay? So in your regression, you have growth, and then you have aid as one of the explanatory variables, and then you also have aid times policy. They sort of plug it in as explanatory variables, and this interaction term is important because the parameter on aid was insignificant, but the one on aid times policy was significant. Okay? Now, and of course, I mean, think about it. The underlying paradigm, of course, is sort of interesting, right? Because the policies that you were supposed to get right were which ones? The exact World Bank, open, not too big deficits publicly, and so on. I mean, it was too good to be true. And quite frankly, when we started digging into it, we got a few surprises, I would say. The first thing is that when you introduce in statistical analysis an aid times policy interaction term, then you should also have the squared terms. I mean, that's a very basic, simple things in statistical analysis. Because what is it the aid policy interaction term really is doing? It is capturing nonlinearities. And from economics we know that a fundamental principle of economics is diminishing returns. And diminishing returns would not be captured by the interaction terms, but would be captured by the square term. The more you give, that might impact on the relationship. So, what did Henrik and I do? Well, we basically, after a long process, were able to show that aid works, but the diminishing return story is a better explanation of the data than Burnside dollar. Now that's pretty important actually, at least from an academic point of view, because it matters what the underlying story is. If the underlying story is the aid works, but only in good policy countries, then policy implications are very different from a story about aid works, but we have some problems with some very high level aid recipients, which we, by the way, probably don't really understand anyway. So the policy implications are very, 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 very different. And I have to say that I have always had strong problems with when they say that it only works in good policy countries, because I have seen it working under pretty bad conditions. And a basic economic insight is what? When a factor is scarce, then the potential return to that factor is high. And I've never been able to understand this thing, that fundamental principle was not accepted. I should move on. Anyway, now it's kind of interesting. Then the debate sort of became, I wouldn't say stale, but it sort of stopped for a little bit. It was very clear that Burnside dollar were very influential in practice. They really changed in a variety of ways how aid was actually allocated. And the Millennium Challenge account of the US is just one example. But for example, the Netherlands completely changed their aid allocation principles. They became selective on these good policy principles. Now then we didn't have sort of a lot, but then sort of what happened was that then we passed the year 2000, and I was sitting in Vietnam actually when the research director of the IMF passed by. He gave a lecture, and he spoke about this aid literature. And all he said was, there's all this talk about doubling of aid, and I really am worried about it. Because if you do that, then you get Dutch disease. And that's not good. Now, I had, as you would have realized, sort of been involved with the aid literature for a while, so we started pushing. And it showed up that they had done no analysis really. I mean, they had just sort of some thoughts about this. Anyway, so he joined up with Subramanian, and they put out a new paper in 2008. It came, of course, in working paper versions around 2005-06. Now, their work then became inspired by criticism of the earlier GMM methods that we had used to try to account for endogeneity with. They essentially argued you can't trust that, because it becomes a black box and you don't know what's going inside that. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. I mean, I actually tend to believe that on this one they're not too far off. So what they basically said, look, you need to essentially get back to some more simple long-run cross-section averages as a way of teasing out of the data the true relationship. You shouldn't rely on these fancy GMM methods because you're not really sure what you're getting. I mean, we can have a long discussion about what this actually means, but it's very clear that there sort of in the US in particular, the reaction against GMM methods was very strong, and you have having leading people like Deaton and others. They really have been strong in terms of attacking the GMM. Anyway, they then concluded going in, when they use long-run cross-section averages, and then Renaud and Subramanian say, we cannot find any robust positive systematic effect of aid, and it seems to hold for all kinds of aid, all types of aids, and alternative time periods. We've covered it all, they say. Now, the first reason to be a little bit skeptical is that when you say that you've done it for all different types of aid and alternative time periods of aid, it's generally understood in this literature that there is a limit to how much we yet can disaggregate. Because if we start disaggregating, it's extremely hard to get things to be significant for statistical reasons. The data series are too short, lots of things. But anyway, let me now speed up a little bit. But what should you expect? What should we expect from this relationship? Well, if you go back to very simple Herodomo, you remember growth is equal to the savings ratio divided by the capital output, S divided by K. Well, all right. If you have 10% savings rate and you have a capital output of 3%, then you have sort of about 3.33%, right? If you then add in 10% to GDP in aid, then you basically double the growth rate. These are simple arithmetic calculations. I sort of suggest that aid is reasonably significant. 10% aid to GDP should give you more than 3% additional growth per year. But when you actually do it with modern theory, you would get, lo and behold, the Collier prediction. About 1%. If you sort of really go through, you take account of the fact that there are different factors of production, not just capital, etc., 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 you sort of lower it down to about this 10% aid to GDP should give around 1% increase. This is stated by Renaud. They even have it in a nice appendix of their paper. Now the second thing, of course, is that the time dimension is incredibly important. If you do not consider time here, you're bound to get it wrong. What happens if you give aid to save people's lives? What happens to aid to GDP, GDP per capita? It goes down. In the short run, the impact of aid on GDP per capita is negative. And that has been generalized to other contexts and other literatures, and I'll jump over that. Now, the reason why we sort of ask this question, have we come full circle, is because it sounds very much like full circle, right? We started out with the micro-macro paradox, and now we're back to it. Renaud basically reintroduces the micro-macro paradox. So we started digging into their data, digging into what they had done. So we started with the same data, the same instrument. We looked at the same long-run cross-sections. Now then what we did three things. We improved the instrumentation strategy. We did nothing which is not in the literature. We improved the growth equation specification. We did nothing that's not in the literature. And then we did introduce something that's new. We have studied the modern impact literature at the micro level quite carefully. And we have essentially moved that up at the macro. And what you essentially do there is that you try to think through the question, control, target, what is that you really want to understand here. And here, of course, what you want to understand is whether countries that receive a considerable amount of aid do better, worse, or the same like countries that receive not so much aid. What is the result? We have been unable, we have beaten this data in every possible way, and with these improvements, we simply cannot reject this prior of 0.1. So our conclusion is that, I mean, there is no micro-macro paradox. It's just because people have not been doing their work properly. Now, I won't go through these three steps in detail. I mean, we can do that in discussion if any one of you have specific question. But let me just give you one very, very specific example. Well, let me do one here. When they think about the instrument, when they try to explain what donors do, they don't have donor fixed effects in their regression. I mean, we all know that donor fixed effects are important. Now, they have a data problem. They treat 0 observations as if they're missing, but they should really be treated as 0. Now, you can imagine what that does to a data series if you treat this thing in here as missing, because then it's on that trend where it should be treated as not. But that completely, and it matters. Anyway, now let's get to the results. Okay, so here we have the Renaud paper, right? Their instrument, their specification, their estimator, their result. They're getting exactly the predicted theoretical one, but it's insignificant. And on that basis, you conclude it doesn't work. If you just change the estimator, you get actually 0.15 and a significant result. So if you just accept the estimator that we have introduced, developed, and which is in accordance with the recent literature of all of these impact assessment types, you turn the result around. Okay. Now what happens now if you go down and you take the other specification? Well, here, just think about it for 1 second. this then is our work. Now we get the same here, 0.10, insignificant if we do use the Radianus-Romani estimator. But that one is only insignificant when we test against the null hypothesis being no impact. When we test it against the theoretical prior, which is what? 0.1, right? That was the theoretical prior we had. Then that one actually turns significant. And it also, when we use our estimator, look here, what happens. When we go down here, we take the instrument. It's all significant. And the most reliable one is actually significant, not at the 5, not at the 10%, but at 1% level. And I should say we have replicated this since on 2007 data, and we're getting the same results. So, remembering, this is a table where the null is no impact at all. If you actually test it against the impact of 0.1, then this one turns significant. Now we were stunned, because essentially this is Radianus-Romani sitting up here, and then whatever improvements you do to these three areas turns the results around. So what are the conclusions? Should we worry about A? Some would say no. Some would even say that growth will go up. That's Dambisa-Moyer's argument. Better get A eliminated. We would suggest the impact of A on growth conforms more or less with what you would expect from modern growth theory. Now, there's a good discussion, which is that really satisfactory? I mean, if A is just sort of one among a number of resource flows, is that really what we meant by A? And you can definitely get me to say, no, that's probably not what we were thinking. We were thinking of aid as a strategic instrument that should go in and do strategic things. But on the other hand, it does seem to conform more or less. And it certainly seems as if to sort of get rid of aid in the present financial times is not necessarily the best idea. There certainly are a number of African countries that would be in dire straits. And the evidence is mounting. There's plenty, continues to be plenty of evidence that aid works at the micro. And I mean, it is true to say that on many issues we really do not know at the macro level. But on the other hand, I have been stunned by the fact of having basically been participating in this over now something like 20 years. And every single time that we've gone in and really seriously done the work. By the way, there's a meta discussion out there also now. There is a Danish professor who's been out there, he's sort of saying, I have now done a meta-analysis of aid, and that shows insignificance. It's even in the European Journal of Political Economy. You should take a look at a working paper on WIDER website that has now looked at that study, and you know what happens when you do the work properly? Shifts around, sign turns around, and you're getting more or less the same result, about 0.1 to 0.2 on the parameter. So 10% of GDP, aid to GDP, on average, and I want to stress that, and I want to say that very clearly, on average adds about 1 to 2% to GDP. And I think we should probably discuss this question, what that on average actually means. Now, so I would suggest that to get more impact, you should make aid work better. I don't think that the solution is through selectivity, but let's talk about that. Should we scale up as well? Well, let me say one thing. This work does not prove that scaling up would work. Yeah, oh, sure, I'm ready in too. Does not prove that scaling up would work. I'm actually pretty worried about Jeff Sachs when he runs around saying that aid can do fantastic wonders. Because I'm worried. I worry about the backlash when that might not happen. Anyway, yeah, I think I really should stop here, but one thing I would like to say at the end. If we want to find out where aid really could be scaled up, it's dangerous just to leave it to the economists. We do need here to interact with political scientists who can help uncover, figure out in which political systems it is that we actually can engage with increased aid flows. It will work sometimes, and in others it will not. So, that certainly is part of our wider research agenda in the coming years is to try to figure that out. And with this, Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and this was really a very interesting presentation. I'm by no means an economist, but I think I understood everything that you said, so this is very good. But this is also the reason why I am not the discussant. We need a real professional for this, and Joachim from Braun will now start with a few critical questions. Joachim, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a splendid lecture, Finn. This is a very significant piece of research on the role of aid. Outlining the evidence of impact of aid on GDP, on economic growth, emphasizes a strong focus on a key economic variable. To clarify evidence on the bottom line of the aid impact, I think is very important for at least two reasons. One, to fight aid fatigue, and to deal with misleading conversations. To fight excessive fashion trends. It's particularly important for this town. I'm really glad that we attracted you to give this talk here in Bonn. Bonn being an international city with United Nations University and other agencies here, this city has its antennas out regarding what happens to development aid-related strategies. By the way, let me welcome an old ZEF alumnus, not old in age, but long-standing, Professor Mandur Nasser from Cairo and Shams University. And also welcome from the ZEF perspective, Dr. Renaud, your colleague, UNU Vice Rector. Finn, I think I forewarned you that, and I have to regret to inform you that it's our culture that we try to give our dear guests a hard time in these types of seminars. So that much for friendliness and praise. You had said, why are there these disagreements? I think you missed out on the key reason. Why are there these disagreements? Is among the academics, and you mentioned a few names, academics have to disagree. That's the fundamental reason. It's an intrinsic cause, but let me make three comments which I would like to push you on. The first one is your dependent variable is flawed, GDP. GDP grows, the GDP accounting systems are deficient, natural resources are not properly accounted for, the lack of linkages to public goods, the lack of representation of what we want to change, people's well-being, is not well accounted for. I refer to the, for those of you in the audience who would like to follow up, to the Commission on Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress by Joe Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and others, the so-called Sarkozy Commission. So I think your next attempt to explain the role of aid should revisit your very dependent variable from that perspective. Secondly, same in the same context. Your purchasing power adjustment PPP has changed. The review of PPP adjustment factors about 3 years ago gave surprising changes. So another flaw in your dependent variable. So there is room for improvement on that side. I predict it won't change much, but I want to see it from you. Second point. Your aid variable, P variable, I think needs also a bit more attention. And you mentioned that at the end. This variable has all sorts of shocks and variabilities. I point, for instance, at the food aid component of aid, which behaves exactly opposite for many decades in your 1960 or 1970 to 2000 period. It went down when the world needed, the poor countries needed the most food. So a terrible aid behavior. When food got expensive, food aid went into the rat hole, which you quoted. For food aid, it really applies the rat hole hypothesis. It has become a lot better in the last decade, that particular component of aid, but there are rat hole events. In view of our agenda in this seminar series, maybe in the discussion time you can also visit the issue of risk. So the volatility of aid becoming a macroeconomic risk issue and thereby causing less than what you expect in terms of economic benefits. My third comment relates to what has happened in more recent decades. Your time series end 2000, year 2000. They are long term, 1960s or 70s to 2000s, in this excellent paper. But we could, of course, say every decade in your period of analysis was exceptional, like economists like to say the last 1,000 years were exceptional when they talk with historians. But I think the last 10 years will be a challenge for your analysis, the 2000 to 2010. And that is the extended role of China in the aid story and its ripple effects on global growth. Not just China itself, a big example of growth without aid. Actually, a growth without aid and with discrimination at times. You really need to challenge yourself with the China example. It saw the unfolding of the ICT, the information and communications technology revolution, into low-income developing countries. And so I look forward, if you put your own analysis to the dollar, etc. test, you see, when you didn't mention that, but in your paper it is, when a few years of time series extension were added to that very famous study, it fell apart. So they had a reason to hide their data for some years, to have the impact, one could cynically say. Again, I think we all benefited hugely from your presentation. It's important for our perspective. Despite of my comments, my conclusion is, no doubt, aid has positive impact on economic growth and development. And don't get carried away. I tell my dear audience, colleagues in the audience, don't get carried away by this or that flawed project. That's the wrong perspective. Aid can be improved, must be improved, and my last little question is, given what you said at the end, scaling up, what is the optimal scale of aid? What's the optimal scale of aid? Should be able to derive that at the margin from your estimates. Anyway, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to further cooperation and discussion with you in the future.
Thank you very much, Joachim. I take your points. And what should I say? I should say that they show that you are a very professional and very experienced researcher and economist. And I really do not, I mean, fundamentally, I don't really disagree with any of the points that you mentioned. But let me still try to, still elaborate on them. And then hopefully sort of out of that comes some sense. I think I'm going to take them in the order or the sequence that you did it. But I would like to just make, before I get started, one point about the flawed projects. Nobody criticizes private enterprises for projects that don't give the expected return. In fact, we would criticize a private company if it always had positive returns on all of their projects. I mean, any investment analysis, portfolio management, whatever you can, I mean, go into all of that. If you really always have a positive result, there's something wrong. You are not optimizing. You might be satisfying them, but you're not optimizing. I happen to believe in trying to optimize, or at least not just satisfy. So I completely agree with that point. I mean, the fact that there are aid projects that don't succeed, it simply should not get attention away from what is the big story. And I mean, development is very tricky business. We're dealing with things where there are lots of things we don't know. And that's what we're here to. We're here to try to add that little S6, the bit that each and one of us can add to the existing amount of knowledge. And the fact that something doesn't quite work out is not to be despair. It's to be turned around as a challenge. And I think that analog to private investment is at least relevant to think about. Now, the dependent variable, I couldn't agree more. I mean, GDP does not in any simple way measure well-being. On the contrary, in lots of situations, GDP gets it wrong. I mean, I've been heavily involved in Vietnam for the last few years, and that's an example where that's so incredibly obvious. The GDP growth they've had, we've tried to adjust for environmental damage and all kinds of things, the running down of assets, and you are getting very different estimates just on that simple basis. So I completely agree with you that the GDP is not a proper measure for lots of the things that we're dealing with. Now, that doesn't prevent Burnside Dollar, Adjana Subramanian, and lots of other people from using it and drawing conclusions. So one of the motivations that we've had is, in all simplicity, is just to sort of say, okay, if we look at these data, what do we get? Now, we have tried, and we are in the process of working with this. What happens when you substitute the growth variable, the GDP variable, including instead poverty measures, including instead health indicators, health outcomes, including education, schooling outcomes. In other words, all the kinds of things where you may have a better, more firm handle on the indicator. And essentially, we have so far, but we're still in the process, so I don't want to sort of declare, in quote, if you wish, victory yet. But we generally do not get big surprises. We generally get the same story. In other words, aid tends to decrease poverty. Aid does work on the education side. On the health side, we have some difficulties because even sort of the medical scientists know that in the 90s there was something going on which you couldn't quite figure out. The relationship between economic variables and the health outcomes is messy. It's in all of the medical journals and so on. So that one we're struggling with. But you're absolutely right. Now, what has been the underlying story here has essentially been the simplistic one: get growth and then you solve problems. Now, I mean, that's a very simple one. Take Paul Collier's story about what is the role of aid in conflict situations, post-conflicts countries. What is his argument? His argument is you need to get growth because growth will then help stabilize things. But that's actually not obvious. It may well be that if you're doing the wrong things there, then you create incentives for people actually not to settle the conflict. Because there might be something for them still to fight about, or still to try to loot. So that link is not nearly as obvious as it sounds maybe if you don't reflect on it. We do know that growth, broadly understood, generally tends to reduce poverty, even with the old figures and so on. But we also know now, much more keenly than we've known for some time, that the growth poverty stories in Africa are much more complex than what we had thought. For exactly the reasons you're mentioning. For exactly those reasons. Take Mozambique, a country I know pretty well. Okay, 1996, poverty decreased very substantially. 2002, clearly a decrease. Okay, post-war reconstruction, lots of good things happening, and then people were all expecting it to continue down because we still have growth there. Now, we have been responsible for the household survey in Mozambique. The analysis of it, much to the disliking of the World Bank, because they were not quite comfortable that somebody independent was doing it. But we did not find that poverty had decreased. We found that poverty was flat. So the story in Mozambique is decreased from 1996 to 2002 and then flat. Why? Lots of reasons. But one fundamental, pretty simple fact is you haven't gotten small peasant agriculture going. Productivity is the same as it was 40 years ago. Now, if you just stop for 1 second and then think, okay, 75% of your population doing basically the same things that they did 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, how can you actually see a major decrease in poverty? So that's one part of the story. Another thing is food price increases and so on and so forth. So there are lots of things going on, but it's more to recognize that I completely agree that this literature suffers from one big illusion. It should be broadened out. Now, why is it that GDP, and I'm now going to get to the aid variable, why is it that we do it? Because we tend to have relatively longer series. One problem with statistics is you can't do it with very few observations, or when you do it with very few observations, you tend to get insignificance. And that's the problem. And that's why we, and in my case, it has been partly responsible. And I get your point, but I honestly don't think I should make too many apologies for it. But you're right, we should get on with it. It is an essential element of the wider aid project that we are now starting up. I'll try and speed up. The aid variable needs attention, absolutely. I agree with that. The problem again is if we start disaggregating, we're basically getting into insignificance. And the problem, of course, is that, well, insignificance doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means we haven't found it. Because you, in principle, should either establish positive or negative, right? But anyway, risk and volatility. I have mixed feelings about that debate and that literature. There is a considerable amount of papers out there that basically suggests that the volatility of the aid relationship means that it's not as effective as it could be. And I tend sort of generally to agree with that. My problem is that when you actually look at the volatility of aid flows and compares it with trade, commodity, all other kinds of flows, then aid is actually less volatile. So now that doesn't mean aid is not volatile, but it's less. So if you were a little bit kind of naive about it, you would say, well, if you add a variable, a flow that's less volatile than the other ones, you would tend to add a little bit. Now, that doesn't mean that we should not try to become more predictable. We should. But that's the issue I have a little bit with that volatility discussion. But have we seen aid being dispersed in big lumps at the end of the year with balance of payment checks that were paid out because donors were sitting there with some cash to show that they just want to ship out? Absolutely. And that's of course not good for aid effectiveness. That's not the right way of going about doing business. I believe that some of the risks that are associated with aid is that if you build up a relationship and then you don't actually play by the rules of that relationship, and that has happened also too many times. We've seen donors shifting. They started out doing one thing, then they shift, and then they shift. That is one of the major risks that I perceive in this. And one of the reasons why I keep talking about savings, investment, growth, is because if we could just get them to concentrate on that. Not all the time sort of shift around between whatever is the latest fad in town. Maybe we then could have some impact that's bigger than what we have. Now, the last decade, we have reproduced all the results up to 2007, and it changes nothing. I mean, it's exactly the same up to 2007, which is where we have the data. There was a little bit of quibbling about the oil-producing countries because oil prices were sort of moving around so much that they create a little bit of, but generally it stays the same. I should also add that we have, of course, tried the other aid variables, the effective development assistance, where you try to take out of the ODA measure the share that's just loans and so on and so forth. That again doesn't change. But it's very clear that the changing global context is going to change some of these things very clearly. It's very clear. And on that, I basically agree. Now let me use your reference to growth without aid point to try as strongly as I can to say that there is nothing in what I've said that should be interpreted as me saying that good policies are not a good thing. I have not said that good policy is not to be strived after. I mean, I'm sometimes understood like, oh, you think that aid, so that good policy is not a good thing. You're only concerned about, no. I mean, we are economists, we are policy economists, we like to find the good policies. But the issue is the effectiveness of aid conditional on good policy? And not always. You can do things even if policy might not always be perfect. Now, growth without aid? Absolutely. The problem is that it might not be all countries that can make it. It's not all countries that are China. Vietnam had some very significant aid inflows. They, admittedly, tried to get some things right in terms of the framework right in the beginning. But did Vietnam have good policy? By lots of standards, they are rock bottom on a number of these policy indicators. Why? Because they intervene heavily in the agriculture. Do you know what Vietnamese peasants, even to this day, how much of their land is actually subjected to intervention in terms of what they must grow? 40%. 40% of plots in Vietnam have to grow rice. Now that's not a good policy, right? Or is it? I mean, so what I'm trying to suggest here is that this discussion, I should stop now. Sorry, I'm getting carried away. Yeah, scaling up. What is the optimal level? Yes, there are calculations out there. If you accept the diminishing story, then of course you should be able to sort of calculate that optimum. The problem is just that the diminishing return story is still relatively fragile. To come out and say, I believe the optimal level should be, I have hesitated. Do I believe that there are countries that can absorb more aid than they are presently doing? I believe so. I think that there are cases. Look, if you take Mozambique, maybe can I ask a little bit provocatively and just say, how much aid do you think is out there? Take Tanzania. Tanzania is normally considered a really heavy aid recipient. How much per person in Tanzania? $35 per year. 20 bottles of Coke per person. Now, I mean, so can Tanzania absorb more? Well, if they want to build that highway or that road up that sort of connects, and so, you know, there are things that can be done, but it does presume that we are getting the aid relationship and the political economy right. If that can be done, then I do believe that absorptive capacity is above 20 bottles of Coke per person. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Finn.
I apologize if I went on too long.
No, that's fine. So we'll take some questions from the floor. I would like to ask you if you could introduce yourself very briefly and then put the question to Finn, and I'll maybe accumulate 2 or 3 questions before I give the floor to Finn. So please, sir.
My name is Erich Weder. I'm a retired professor of sociology at this university. And my impression is that your aid optimism is essentially driven by 2 things you have done. The first is you have changed the counterfactual. That is, your counterfactual is no longer 0 effects, but a small effect derived from economic theorizing. I think that's a legitimate step, but it reminds me, because it's so small a step, to go from 0 to 0.10, that all our findings are likely to be fragile. This, of course, does not only apply to you, but also to your critics. That's the first step which you took. The second step which you took is you changed your econometrics. Unfortunately, you did not give us much detail about that, and I would like to see the equations. In particular, you made a somewhat oblique reference to one of your Danish colleagues. I guess it's Martin Paldam from Aarhus University, and I happen to know him, and I think he is a great scholar. And somehow I would expect that you and he disagree about the specification which you use or should use in your estimation equation. And if this suspicion on my part is true, I would like to see his estimation equation and your estimation equation in order to be capable of making a judgment for myself. Because by and large, I think, it frequently happens that intelligent people do not agree on what the best estimation equation is. And assuming that my suspicions are related to the truth, I would like to get some more technical information in order to understand what you have done and how that might drive your results.
Thank you. I'll take another question. Yes?
I have a very different and non-economic question, since I'm a physicist by education. Actually, I'm not an economist. Looking from the results, Finn, you argued that there is a sense in scaling up. I was wondering if from your analysis there is also on a kind of a general basis an information on an improvement on a more qualitative side. So just bluntly asking, what would you recommend in terms of general recipes for improving aid, for example, also in view of the Chinese way in Africa? Can we learn something from the analysis?
Finn, if you want to take it.
Yeah, sure, no, I can take a couple. Now, let me first of all say that it's simply incorrect to say that I've changed the counterfactual. The result I showed they were against the counterfactual of aid having zero impact. And then I made the point that if instead I had made it against the 0.1, then the one number, the second one down, would then have also been significant. So the story doesn't change. A few of the details, but the general story has nothing to do with changing the counterfactual. I mean, that's just sort of to be very direct. There is no change of counterfactual here. We took the Radiana Subramanian, we took the Birdseye dollar, and so on, counterfactuals, and we took them serious. So now, that said, I believe that it's pretty clear from what I presented that this is a fragile literature. Our paper has now been out there for about a year, and to date nobody has been able to even pinpoint that that could be somehow shown with a small trick not to hold. David Rootman, who is the, how can you say, toughest statistician who's out there, he has himself stepped up and said, this is the most robust stuff that I have seen ever in this literature. So, am I saying we've solved it? No. But I am saying it's the most robust that's out there. So, would you want to trust something that's less robust? Well, that's the good discussion. Now, the econometrics. I mean, quite frankly, it's impossible in a short seminar like this to deal in depth with all of the econometric issues. Now, they're in the paper, obviously. They have been tested, they have been checked, they have been... And this I present today has nothing to do with Palma. I made in reference a comment about the study he has put out, which is based on meta-analysis. I'm not commenting on this today. But let me now take a comment on that and say why there is a difference with his meta-study. And if you want all of his equations and all of our equations, they're out, published on the web in a working paper. And I'll tell you where there is one fundamental difference. There's one fundamental difference in how you code data. It took us 2.5 years to recode all of that data, and there were data errors in their coding. That matters for the results. We then also, and this was a long discussion, but there are two ways of trying to analyze meta-analysis. What is a meta-study? A meta-study is where you basically consider all of the analysis done out there as one observation. It's very useful in medical sciences, right? Because you do very specific controlled experiments, and then you compare them all, and then you basically imply things from that universe of observations where each observation is the study. And there are lots of techniques and so on. Now, in medical sciences, it is sensible to use an assumption where you say that all these different studies that you're now comparing, that they are essentially estimating the same thing. Because they're closely controlled experiments, right? If you take 68 growth studies over these many years, and then you say they are estimating the same thing, you're making a fundamental mistake. Because you're not taking account of the fact that by the very nature of the fact that these studies are done with different methodologies over different, etc., 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 they are bound by definition not to estimate the same thing. When you correct for that, you know what happens? The insignificant result turns around. Chook! If you use the right estimator, it's out there, it's on the web, you can see the explanation for why it is we believe that Talham is off. But this was not the discussion, this was not the literature I present today, this was the discussion about the meta, because I actually happen to believe that meta-analysis, at least in this area of research, is not particularly useful. I mean, I just don't think it's, but the reason why we spent 2.5 years trying to look down into it was because he was very influential. Okay. So the truth and nothing but the truth. Well, let me say one thing, and maybe that links back to Joachim. I actually don't think always that academics disagree because they're academics. They sometimes disagree because they play politics.
What is endogenous?
That's exactly right. Anyway, leaving that aside, what would I recommend in terms of scaling up? I wrote a paper back in whatever 2003, 2004, no 2002 actually, where I was. Some people didn't particularly appreciate it because I thought that I actually think that we should try to think of the aid relationship in much more contractual terms than we are used to in the past. I actually believe that thinking about it that way is better than the ownership concept that's sort of floating around out there. Now, I believe in people taking responsibility for their own future. In that sense, I believe in ownership. I've been training people, working in governments, and so on and so forth, all over the place. And of course, in that sense, I believe in building capacity and building ownership in that sense. But the idea that countries can own aid programs, I have difficulty with it. I can own a piece of land, and I can do with it what I want. But owning an aid program, it's better, in my view, to get the discussion about the contract on the table. Am I then saying it should be old-fashioned conditionality of the 80s? That's not exactly what I'm saying. But I think one area where we could have significant improvement is if we were much clearer in what we are expecting on the two sides. And that sometimes, and probably more frequent than we see now, that actually has consequences. I don't think that it helped aid efficiency or aid effectiveness in Kenya that we kept giving conditional when we saw for whatever fifth times that the Kenyan government didn't care about doing the things that actually had been agreed. Sure, then aid did go down eventually, but it didn't go down because of those. They went down for other reasons, right? So that's one aspect of the aid relationship where I think that a changed relationship could, and I believe, quite frankly, in being more direct, in being more honest. That would be one area. And that's, I mean, the Chinese way. Well, I guess the Chinese are more direct. They say what they want, and then they make sure that they deliver. That has not always been the complete relationship between some of the Western aid donors and recipients. They've been asking things, and then they didn't always deliver. I mean, you know, you came, you changed things, and then you didn't deliver. The Chinese seem to be delivering, and I actually happen to think, sure, we need to be thinking about what the Chinese are doing, but, I mean, let me give you one example why I kind of think of it as an opportunity for a number of African countries, at least. Mozambique, we did a big study of taxes in Mozambique and so on and so forth. And one of the papers that we did was a paper where we analyzed what would have been the tax to GDP ratio of the Mozambican government if they had just gotten the average deal on natural resource extraction projects. The average African deal. The ratio would have been 35%. Now, in my view, this is a suggestion that it's not that Western companies have not been exploiting Africa. So we shouldn't always be thinking about it in a negative way. There are opportunities, and I'm actually pretty optimistic that some of the Africans are pretty clear about it. They know well that the Chinese want this and do that and so on. Now, where I see the issue is in relation to corruption. And that's where I do fear what might be sort of the consequences of this. And that's where the attention that there is to improving transparency in terms of natural resource extraction, contracts and so on, so which is coming. Another way to improve aid, I think that we need a lot more, how can you say, honest communication, research on what goes well and what does not go so well. Aid agencies has, as Joachim was also suggesting, sort of, they've been scaring away. I mean, every time they're sort of walking away from it and trying to hide it and trying not to ignore it, they sort of make it as if it didn't happen. I think that's a mistake. On the contrary, you learn from your mistakes. So I would be much more transparent. I would put them on the table. But of course, there is the political economy in the donor countries that makes that sometimes very difficult. I think that there is a major issue on data information. I think that we are hampered by data systems which are presently much too weak. I think the fact that we are still struggling with making our micro level and our macro level data speak with each other. I mean, sometimes we use sort of tricks to sort it out. I mean, using different kinds of methods to sort of at least make sure that they're consistent. But the basic fact is that both the micro and the macro data are about the same reality. I mean, it's the same economy that's out there. I mean, you know, I mean, in principle, it should square. I think that that would be one way, because aid is part of that understanding what actually goes on in the economy. Yeah, I think I tried to address it. If not, then challenge me.
No. I think there was one more hand, and I think we have time for just one more question. If you can make it short and then have a short answer, and we'll finish it, please.
Yeah, my name is Philip Baumgartner. I'm a PhD student here at ZEF. I have a question regarding your interaction term. I think you said you squared it. But what did you do about the policy indicator in there? I saw in the paper it was used from the Sachs and Warner paper. That was what Dollar, I think, were using, and I think their paper was also strongly criticized for just using the Washington consensus indicators for policy.
Yeah, sure.
Did you move beyond that, and if so, how?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, I should say that we did not make the mistake of, for example, only including A squared. I mean, we went all the way. In other words, we took the A times policy, we introduced H squared, we introduced policy squared, etc., etc. And policy squared never explained anything. It's dead insignificant. It doesn't add anything to the story. Okay, so and that intuitively that also seems to make some sense, because you know it's not obvious that that the nonlinearity would be hidden in the policies. So that's why when you do the, how can you say, econometric aspects, it becomes A times policy and H squared. But everything has been done with policy squared in there as well. Now, we, in the first responses we made, we clearly just used, yes, exactly the three policies, and you can have a long discussion whether they really are good policy and so on and so forth. We did exactly that. And the beauty, of course, of what Burns had done, I mean, it's a brilliant study in sort of in the policy world, right? Because their policy indicator consists of three things. So it has an easy, understandable. You can straight go out and say, do this, and that's good policy, right? So the open economy towards trade, not so much deficit and not so much inflation. The fact that these three things are actually interlinked is, we just sort of put it a bit under the carpet. We don't think too much about it. So we did everything with those three. But we didn't stop there, actually. Now, I have not spoken about that today, but there is actually an economic journal paper that you might want to have, you might actually want to consult, because I personally actually think that that is the academically strongest of these papers that are out there. The 2004 economic journal paper with Dalka. Because there what we did was that we not only went into the policy defined with the three specific policies, we took the whole index that the World Bank uses, because we had not had access to that before. But we took that whole index of whatever, 22 indicators, and we went through everything. The same thing occurs. Now, what we added in that paper, which I personally think is a very strong argument and merits reflection, is policy is often endogenous. And that, for me, is part of sort of the insight in this, is if you want a condition on policy, you might actually be, in a sense, giving some of the poorest a double whammy. Because first of all, they suffer from bad policy, wherever that comes from, probably in some cases related to bad choices by their leaders, but in other cases also due to bad natural conditions, and so on. So that's sort of, if you wish, the really exogenous kind of stuff, right? Now, if you then add to that you don't give them aid because they have bad policy, to me that's somehow problematic. I mean, I'm not really saying that we should be naive about it, but it does suggest to me that we shouldn't allocate aid based on simple macroeconomic indicators. We need to go beyond that. If I may, Mr. Chair, just one word about where my optimism comes from.
Go ahead.
It doesn't come from this stuff. It has nothing to do with this stuff. This stuff is about trying to get a debate, an international discussion right, because I think it's misused. My optimism comes from the fact that I spent more than half my working life traveling and working in developing countries and seeing what goes on. And I've seen aid failures, absolutely. But I have also seen it working. And yeah, that's where the optimism really comes from. Sorry. Thank you.
Finn, thank you very much for this brilliant lecture, for finishing on an optimistic this lecture. And I think it's also, as Joachim mentioned, it's quite important because we're right now having the climate talks, and later on we have the COP in Durban, where aid and climate change adaptation also is going to be discussed. So your lecture is really timely for what is happening here today as we speak in Bonn. So again, thank you very much, and this was really nice. I would like to thank Joachim for putting the pressure on Finn that I couldn't do, and this was done also very nicely and triggered a very interesting discussion. And finally, thank to all of you for coming again en masse for our lecture series. And I hope that we see you all Friday next week for the next lecture, which will be given by Dr. Salim Ul-Huk from Bangladesh. So until then, have a good week and a half. Thank you.
Thank you.